And when Moses came down from the Mount Sinai, he held the 2 tables of the testimony, and he knew not that his face was horned from the conversation of the Lord. And Aaron and the children of Israel, seeing the face of Moses horned, were afraid to come near. And being called by him, they returned, both Aaron and the rulers of the congregation. And after that he spoke to them. And all the children of Israel came to him, and he gave them in commandment all that he had heard of the Lord in Mount Sinai. And having done speaking, he put a veil upon his face. And they saw that the face of Moses when he came out was horned, but he covered his face again, if at any time he spoke to them. What makes this story interesting is that for most of us, we don't have memories of reading this story in our Bible or learning about it in Sunday school. And yet, nevertheless, if you open up the pages of many Bibles out there in the world today, you'll find this story exactly where it's supposed to be found in Exodus 34. And that's what we're talking about today. Welcome back to the Plague of Frogs. So just to briefly recap the story, we find Moses on the top of the holy mountain, Mount Sinai, communing with God. And after receiving the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets, Moses descends to dispense them to the people of Israel. But Moses doesn't realize that his contact with God has altered his appearance. His face, according to some versions of the Bible, has sprouted horns. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about what exactly that means and what's going on in this text, as well as why it only shows up in some versions of the Bible and not in others. I also want to point out the fact that while I was in grad school, somebody once described this story as the horny Moses story, and that is not a sentence I ever wanted to hear, and I suffer for it every day. And so you have to suffer with me. You're welcome. The version of the story that you heard read to you a moment ago comes from the Douay-Rheims translation of the Bible. Now, the Douay-Rheims is one of many translations that carries this odd rendering of the story, but the common thread between all of these different versions that contain this story is that they're all based ultimately on the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate was the base Latin text that's used for most, if not all, Catholic Bible translations from antiquity through modern day. So the question really is, how did the Vulgate come about, and why did this story achieve this form exclusively in Vulgate translations? The Vulgate project was an ambitious translation project that took place in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. The goal, which was decreed by Pope Damascus I himself, was to produce a normative Latin translation of the Bible for use throughout the Latin West. And the scholar who was chosen to lead this project was one Eusebius Sophronius Hieronymus, known to most people as Saint Jerome, or Uncle Jerry for short. You see, for a long time in the Mediterranean, the lingua franca, that is to say, the common language that everybody spoke in addition to their native tongue, had been Greek. The proliferation of Greek in the ancient world began with the conquest of Alexander the Great around 330 BC, and it continued on for several centuries. But another shift in language took place sometime in the 3rd century AD, about 500 years after the time of Alexander. At this point, large parts of the Mediterranean, primarily in the western section of it, began speaking more and more Latin and less Greek. And this began to produce a problem for a lot of the churches in this area, because you see, the Old Testament of the Bible that Christians used was the Greek version, and the New Testament itself was also written in Greek. So the Bible, for most Christians in the ancient world, was Greek, and yet all of a sudden, or I should say slowly but surely, everybody started to speak more Latin and less Greek. So as a result, the priests of various churches throughout the Western Mediterranean had to get crafty to make this work. Those who were sufficiently educated and fluent in both Greek and Latin could make translations on the fly. They could look at a Greek Bible and render it into Latin as they used it in their sermons for the people. But for many other priests, they wanted to have an actual Latin translation for their people to have better access to. The problem was there wasn't really a united effort to make a united Latin translation, and so as a result, every different priest, or maybe every different church or bishopric in different parts of the Mediterranean would make their own translations from Greek into Latin. And as a result of that, there was a lot of confusion, because you could go to one church in one part of the Mediterranean and hear the Bible in Latin rendering a passage in a certain way. But if you go to the neighboring church, or if you go to a church on the other side of the Mediterranean, you'll also hear a Latin translation that sounds completely different from the first. And this was the situation that the church was facing throughout the 3rd century with the proliferation of Latin and the decay of Greek in the Western Mediterranean. The problem was finally addressed by Pope Damascus I in the mid to late 4th century AD. Christianity had been legalized, things were looking up, and the Pope wanted to make sure that there was a uniform and authoritative Latin translation of the Old and New Testaments for everybody, at least in the Latin-speaking world, to use. And the man that the Pope chose to lead this project was the aforementioned Saint Jerome. As it turns out, Jerome was a fantastic pick to lead this project, because he was one of the few Christians in antiquity who actually had formal training in the original biblical languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. Now remember that the New Testament was written originally in Greek, and so translating from Greek to Latin wouldn't have been particularly difficult for anybody who had training or experience with both languages. But there were very few in the early church who were familiar with Hebrew and Aramaic, and even fewer who were familiar with those languages enough to base an entire translation of the Old Testament on. So Jerome was one of a very select group of people across the ages who could have actually handled a project like this. And as it turns out, this was a really good idea for another reason. The various attempts by various priests to translate the scriptures from their original languages into Latin accidentally caused a bit of an issue with the Old Testament. You see, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but the versions that the early Christians were using was called the Septuagint, which is an oversimplification, but basically the Old Testament converted into Greek. And so the Greek Old Testament was the basis for these various priests and bishops who were using it as their basis for a Latin translation. Essentially, before Jerome's time, people were taking a Hebrew text, which had been translated into Greek. They were then taking that Greek text and translating it into Latin. So there were 2 different translations by the time you wind up with the final Latin text. Jerome wanted to bypass all of that, and because he knew Hebrew and Aramaic, he didn't need the Greek intermediary. He could just go from Hebrew and Aramaic to Latin, which is fantastic. It's worth noting, too, that this earned Jerome some enemies, especially in the East. You see, not everybody in the ancient world was moving towards Latin. This was primarily, obviously, based in Rome, but in the Western Mediterranean. In eastern parts of the ancient world, like Syria and even Asia Minor, Greek remained one of the dominant languages. And so the use of the Greek Old Testament, which had been tradition in Christian tradition up until that time, was heavily defended by a lot of people who were opposed to Jerome's translation project. Very, very nasty things were said about Jerome because he chose to use the Hebrew Old Testament as the basis for his translation rather than the Greek Old Testament that the church had been using for centuries by that point. Now, although Jerome was exceptional among the ancient Christians in that he was actually able to competently work in Hebrew and Aramaic, there were still difficulties that he encountered. Some of these difficulties are still problems that modern scholars debate about. And one of those difficulties is how to translate a Hebrew word that shows up very few times in the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. You see, the meaning of a word is determined by how it's used. So if you have a word that's used 500 different times, as many words in the Old Testament are, you can look at how those words are used to figure out what the word can mean. This is called establishing a semantic domain. I promise not to get too deep into the linguistics of it, but it's going to help us understand what's going on in the Horned Moses passage. Essentially, the more times a word gets used, the more examples you have of what a word can do in that language. So if you have lots of examples of what a word can do, then you have the different options of what that word can mean in a given passage. And then based on the context of that passage, as well as some other clues, you determine which of the possible meanings of that word best fits here. Unfortunately, however, this particular passage centers around a word that shows up only 4 times in the Old Testament. And this is a problem that Jerome himself ran into, and that scholars today run into as well, with a lot of different words, but also with the word in this passage. So to spare you a lesson in lexicography, suffice it to say that the word that appears in this passage of Exodus, the word that describes what's happening to Moses' face, can actually be translated in one of 2 different ways. The first way is to refer to horns sprouting from something, or something literally horning outwards. On the other hand, the word can be translated as referring to something approximating lightning. The exact nuances of what exactly it refers to is unclear. It could be lightning, it could be rays of sunshine, but very clearly a luminescence of some sort is implied by this second possible translation of this word. Now, most of the time when you come across a word that can have one of several different meanings, the context makes it clear. For instance, if a text is describing an ordinary sheep running along a field somewhere, and this word is used to describe it, chances are it's referring to the fact that that sheep has horns. Likewise, if it's referring to a thundercloud moving across the sky, it's probably referring to the fact that there is lightning coming from the thundercloud. Now, in very specific instances, for instance, in a vision, one might find a ram that has lightning coming out of its head, or one might find a thundercloud that somehow is sprouting horns. I don't think we have any examples like that in biblical literature, but it's technically possible for it to happen. But I'd say 9 times out of 10, the context makes it clear. If we're talking about goats or sheep or other animals that have horns, it's probably referring to the fact that horns are coming out of the animal's head. If we're talking about the weather system, about clouds, about rain, chances are this word is used in reference to thunderbolts and lightning. Very, very frightening. The unfortunate part about Exodus 34 is that neither of these contexts are particularly helpful. There aren't any sheep around, and there doesn't seem to be any thunderclouds. The sun isn't exactly mentioned, so technically this word could be translated in either way without breaking the rules of semantics. The fact that this word can be translated in more ways than one comes out in the ancient translations of Exodus 34. Jerome wasn't the only person to ever translate the Bible into another language. We have several different examples. So, for instance, the Greek Septuagint, or the Greek Old Testament, translates, instead of a physical horn characteristic coming out of Moses' head, the word that they use is doxazo, which means this glorious visage of Moses, instead of the horn visage of Moses. This is a similar approach taken to the Aramaic Targum tradition and throughout most of medieval rabbinic interpretation of this passage. There was one interpreter, however, who chose the literalistic option, and that was a man by the name of Aquilla. I mentioned a little while ago that the Greek Old Testament was the version of the Old Testament that most Christians used up until the time of Jerome, and for several of them, well after Jerome's time. But the Greek Old Testament project was originally a Jewish project. As more and more Jewish people started to speak Greek, they needed a Bible written in their own language. And so sometime around the 4th or 3rd century BC, we see the production of the Greek Old Testament, commonly called the Septuagint. Now, that deserves its own episode, and I believe Tommy and I are talking about that on our main channel here pretty soon, so whenever that comes out, I'll try to add a link in the description of this video if you want to learn more about it. But suffice it to say that the Greek Old Testament was originally a Jewish project. But although it was originally a Jewish project, as Christianity spread, more and more Christians started to see the Old Testament as their scriptures as well, even Gentile Christians, that's to say Christians who weren't Jewish. So as more and more Christians started to use the Old Testament, they also started to interpret it in a Christocentric manner. That's to say, they looked at the prophecies of the Old Testament and they saw Jesus hiding within them. And obviously for Orthodox Jews who don't believe in the Messiahship or the resurrection of Jesus, this was a little bit of a problem. Also by this time, because this has been several hundred years since the Greek Old Testament had first been translated from Hebrew into Greek, there was some wear in the age of the translation. That's to say, the translation was a little bit outdated. So we started to see more efforts among Jewish circles to produce contemporary Greek translations of the Hebrew Old Testament. Essentially, this was a way of updating the Greek Old Testament for Jewish use, while also avoiding some of the interpretive decisions that fueled Christian exegesis of those scriptures. Ancient tradition remembers 3 Jewish translators who rendered the Old Testament scriptures into Greek around the 2nd century AD. Now, the situation there was a little bit more complicated than what I'm going to describe to you, but what I'm giving you is basically what the ancients talked about. Because in ancient tradition, there was records of 3 translators. There was Theodotion, there was Symmachus, and there was Aquilla. Arguably the most influential and important of these was Aquilla. You see, Aquilla was the disciple of Rabbi Aquilla, who was a very important rabbi around this time, the early 2nd century AD, and if that is the case, then Aquilla would have been responsible for producing a Greek translation that would have served as the replacement for the Old Greek translation for most Greek-speaking Jews, at least within the spheres that Aquilla and Aquilla worked within. Now, Aquila's Old Testament translation is only preserved in fragments. Unfortunately, we don't have any complete manuscripts of it. From what we can tell, however, Aquilla usually preferred a very literalistic rendering of the Hebrew text. In other words, he wasn't going to transfer idioms, he wasn't going to translate things in a metaphorical manner. He wanted to take the Hebrew text and present it as literally as possible in Greek. Now, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it gives you a background of what Aquila's philosophy was and how it influences the translation of the Vulgate. The reason I bring up Aquila's translation is because when he came to Exodus 34, as Jerome himself tells us, Aquilla chose to render the word for the face of Moses, the word describing what's going on with him there, as horned. So in Aquila's translation, because he preferred a more literalistic interpretation of the text, he described the face of Moses as sprouting horns in Exodus 34:29 and following. So this is the situation that Jerome found himself in. He came to this passage of Scripture in his attempt to translate the Hebrew directly into Latin, and he came across a Hebrew word that shows up very infrequently in the Old Testament. In fact, I believe I've mentioned this already, but the Hebrew word that describes what's happening to Moses' face occurs only 4 times in Scripture, and 3 of those events occur in this passage. So if Jerome was looking elsewhere to try to understand the nuances of what this word could mean, he didn't have a whole lot to work with. So as a result, he could have consulted other translations, that other people who knew the language perhaps better than he did even, how those translations rendered this text. And he would have come across 2 different possibilities. He would have found the more metaphorical or perhaps the more meaning-oriented translations of the Aramaic and Old Greek translations, which rendered it as the shining face of Moses or the glorified face of Moses. And he certainly came across Aquila's translation, which prefers a more literalistic rendering, which refers to horns horning out of Moses' face. And again, Jerome himself mentions the fact that he read Aquila's translation of this and consulted it. So Jerome finds a word that's difficult to render. He finds 2 possible meanings that he can translate the word according to, and it seems that he chose the more conservative option, because in the Latin Vulgate, the term that Jerome uses to render this word in Hebrew is cornuta, which is the Latin word for something horning out of something. So that's the story of how the Horned Moses episode came to be found within certain texts of the Bible. Again, most modern translations, even of the Vulgate text, don't utilize this anymore. The Neo-Vulgate, which is the modern version of Jerome's Vulgate, again, it was updated over time as the Latin language developed and as other advances in biblical scholarship advanced as well. But the Neo-Vulgate, which is the modern version of Jerome's Vulgate, prefers a term that's more akin to the glorification imagery than to the horning out imagery. Most other translations prefer this as well, but that's just the story of how this story got into the Bible. But what about what the correct interpretation of this passage is? You see, when I started looking into this passage, I expected to find exactly what I presented you with. Everybody agrees on how to interpret this. It should mean radiant, it should mean glorious, and Jerome made a mistake, or Jerome didn't have a whole lot of resources to work with, so he took the more conservative option and rendered it literalistically. But as it turns out, there's actually a case to be made that the horn imagery is actually appropriate for this text, so that's what we're going to talk about now. So like I said earlier, you could technically render this word in this passage of the Bible in either of those 2 ways. It technically can mean horns coming from something, or it can mean radiance coming off of something, at least in this context. And like I said, normally the context helps you determine what that word means, but since we don't have any context here, we have to look at internal clues in the story and try to figure out what exactly is going on and which translation is more appropriate. So let's start by talking about the glory interpretation, since this is the interpretation that most, though not all, scholars prefer, and that most Bible translations opt for. Again, if you read most modern Bible translations today and go to Exodus 34, look at verses 29 and following, you'll find that Moses is described with a shining, resplendent, or glorious visage when he comes down the mountain rather than sprouting horns. Now again, the word used to describe Moses' face here can technically refer to something luminous or glorious. We're not 100% sure what the context of that word is in Hebrew usage. It could refer to lightning, or it could be a reference to rays of the sun. The lightning interpretation does have the support of a Ugaritic text, which uses the same word to refer to what is clearly lightning in that context. but it could simply mean that the word had broader uses. So sunbeams, lightning, something luminous is coming out of Moses' face here. So that definitely does fall within the usage of the word in Hebrew, and therefore it is a possible option here. On top of that, although it isn't universal, light was a very common motif of describing divine things, not only in Israel but throughout most religions in human history. Now, I want to be careful here because it's typically a bad idea to compare one religion in one part of the world to another religion in a different part of the world. For instance, it's probably not a great idea to compare Israelite religion to Mesoamerican religion with the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecs, etc., because so much space and so much time separated them that we can't really expect there to be a whole lot of cultural overlap. They may have used symbols differently. With that being said, we see a lot of different references to light in a lot of different religions throughout the world. So this may be something that's just back in the minds of all people everywhere, or at least a lot of people, to refer to things that are special or divine in some way. If you'd like to explore the concept of divine light in further detail, I would recommend Mircea Eliade's book, The Mephistopheles and the Androgyne. This is a little bit of an older book, but it's Mircea Eliade, so we'll give him a pass. Specific examples of light being focused around the head area and being associated with divine or quasi-divine individuals is actually pretty widespread. The oldest examples of this is the Melamu, which is a divine light that descended upon Sumerian kings back in ancient Sumerian texts, and this motif continues throughout a lot of Mesopotamian literature. On top of that, we have something similar in early Christian tradition with the halo, which is also a ring or a shroud of light that surrounds the faces of saints or holy people in antiquity. Now, both of these examples are pretty far removed from the time in Israel when they were putting together the story of the Pentateuch and the story of Moses. One of them is about 1,000 years too early, and the other one is about 1,000 years too late. But it does attest to the fact that the idea of a shroud of light was associated with divine, or in this case, semi-divine beings and people in a lot of different cultures everywhere. So there's something sort of implicitly human or implicitly religious about the possibility of this shroud of light. Now, that being said, it isn't particularly common in Jewish writings, in either the Old Testament or in the Second Temple period. That's not to say that light never occurs as a physical descriptor of holy people. It certainly is used of angels on several occasions, but it isn't necessarily the most common thing in antiquity, so we have to take that into account. In his magisterial commentary on Exodus, William Propp discusses the possibility of the radiance of Moses' face being something of a reflection of the glory of God. The metaphor that Propp uses, and he isn't suggesting that the Israelites thought this, but this is the metaphor that he uses, is that Moses' face is reflecting the glory of God in a very similar way to how the moon reflects the glory of the sun. So Moses has been on top of the holy mountain, spending time with God, receiving the commandments of the covenant. And when he comes down to the people, he's absorbed so much of God's glory just by being in contact with him that he's now spilling over and reflecting it to the people, much like how the moon reflects the light of the sun. Now, the ancients didn't think that the moon reflected the light of the sun, at least to my knowledge, but the metaphor is still very poignant for understanding how Moses sort of is a reflection of the divine essence. Now, Propp doesn't necessarily agree with this theory 100%, he just discusses it in his commentary, but it's a very interesting way of looking at it. And there are certain ancient texts in the Hebrew Bible that refer to, especially the people of Israel, reflecting the glory of God for observation by other people. So, because of these texts, and because of the broader theme and motif of light surrounding holy people, especially people who go to the divine realm, it seems entirely possible that the glory option is a good possibility for how to interpret this text. So now that we understand why a lot of scholars opt for the glory interpretation, let's talk a little bit about the horn interpretation. One thing I want to preface this with is that in modern iconography, you could say, we tend to associate horns with the demonic or with the devil. Everybody knows the representation of the devil as a red figure with horns, and demons are typically horned as well. But this is a primarily modern interpretation of this. If you look in the ancient world, especially in the broader world beyond the bounds of Israel, horns were typically considered to be a sign of strength or of divinity rather than a sign of evil. A great example of this is the horned helmet crowns of Mesopotamian kings, which depict multiple sets of horns coming off of the heads of these kings and spiraling upwards towards heaven. On top of this, we have several semi-divine beings or purely divine beings depicted in Canaanite texts as being horned in some way or another. Within the Bible itself, especially in books of prophecy and books of apocalyptic, we see the idea of horns being used to represent strength, and especially in the book of Daniel and the visions contained there, we find terrifying beasts that represent empires of the world portrayed with numerous different horns, and these horns are symbols of their strength and power. So it's totally feasible for Israelites to perceive Moses as having horns in a sort of a positive manner. If this is indeed the correct interpretation of this text, then the Israelites probably would have understood the horns of Moses as being something that Moses picked up from spending too much time in the divine realm. Moses is acting as the intermediary between God and the people of Israel in this text, so he's sort of this almost angelic figure who takes messages from one to the other. And obviously, spending too much time in the divine realm, absorbing the glory of God, there's going to be some after effects of that. And that's the case whether it's the glory interpretation or the horns interpretation that we opt for. Moses has been exposed to the divine realm for a very long time. He's spoken with God face to face, apparently. And so you can't expect somebody to walk away from that unfazed. But one way or another, when Moses comes down the mountain, the people don't recognize him and can't bear to look at him because of what's happening to him. And it's because of that final fact in the story that I think the glory interpretation beats out the horns interpretation. When Moses comes down to see the people, he has to put a veil on his face so that the people can actually stand to look at him. Now, it could simply be that Moses was hideous with horns on his face, or it could simply be that looking at him was frightening for the people, but putting a veil over one's face specifically, which might I add would be very difficult if you have horns coming out of your head, seems to be the idea of shutting off a light source and closing it off so that the radiance of it isn't overbearing to look at. And this also has some parallels with the presence of God as it journeys with the people. When God's presence descends to be among the people, it's veiled behind the tent of meeting. So there's sort of a cloth veil between the presence of God and humankind. We find this later in the Temple of Solomon with the veil between the most holy place and the place where God's presence is. So it seems thematically appropriate that Moses would wear a veil to shield the glory of his face from the people as sort of a little parallel to the way that God has to shield his own glory from the people, with Moses' glory being reflected and God's glory being the source of that glory. So that's sort of the state of the matter. Technically, you could choose to interpret this text either according to the glory interpretation or the horns interpretation, but I think honestly at the end of the day, the glory interpretation wins out. One way or another, it's clear that Moses here is being represented as a semi-divine figure, somebody who's serving as an intermediary between God and humankind, similar to the role of an angel in the Old Testament. If one does opt for the horned Moses interpretation, there's nothing demonic about this representation. It's just an older form of conveying divine contact than a lot of modern interpretations of horns would allow. On top of that, I want to emphasize that choosing to translate this word as horned wasn't a bad choice on Jerome's part. Again, Jerome was working with incomplete information. He had very few examples to compare this very rare word in Hebrew to, and he consulted other translations to see what people did with this. And given the chance to interpret it in a more metaphorical manner or a more literalistic manner, Jerome chose a conservative option and chose the literalistic manner. And I think that says a lot about Jerome's character. He didn't want to accidentally expand upon the text of Scripture to make it mean something that it didn't mean. Given the option to choose the more widened translation example or the more limited translation example, he chose the more limited option. And I think Jerome deserves a lot of respect for that. So, in summary, there's nothing demonic going on with Moses, and there's nothing malicious going on with Jerome. But I really hope that the contents of this video were interesting and maybe made you think a little bit about how the Bible came to be in its present form. So if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I really got frustrated with this video because I recorded it the day before a work trip, and when I came back, the file was corrupted, so I had to record everything all over again. So if you notice a change in the lighting between the beginning of the video and the end, that's because I only got like 5 minutes in yesterday, got frustrated and went to bed. So this morning we're getting it all taken care of. But again, thanks so much for making it to the end here. I'm planning on making weekly videos at this point. I've got a lot of others lined up and all ready to go. Next week's is going to be very interesting. We're going to be talking about the lost prophet of the Old Testament, and see if you can guess who that would be in the comments. I'm really curious to see if anybody can understand who the lost prophet is, so make sure to leave a comment about that. I'm also planning on making a couple of really short videos, just little things that can't warrant like a full 20-minute video on this channel or a 2-hour video on the main channel, but still bear discussion. So keep an eye out for that sometime this week as well. Like I said, we have a lot of ammunition to work with here. The Bible never ceases to be interesting, but if anybody has any passages that they would like to see explored, if anything's confusing, or even better, if anything's weird means fun, by the way, be sure to leave in the comments. Let me know. And again, thanks everybody so much for sticking around. Really hope you all have a great day, and I hope to see you next time too. Take care of yourselves.